This is one of those questions a lot of American Formula One supporters end up asking me. It's one I've always thought I knew the answer to, but never really said it out loud. It all started for me after Gunther Steiner was quoted in an interview saying, "Signing an American driver would be an ambition, but at the moment, there's nobody ready for Formula One in the United States in my opinion." When I read that a couple years ago, I took it as Gunther being Gunther. But then I saw what Jeff Gordon and others were saying back. Then I really started to suspect this might be one of those trigger conversations that is worth exploring. It became clear to me after doing all this research, we as fans, the drivers, the entire experience around Formula One and our favorite motorsports events, all of us are influenced by our cultures. Ultimately, the question more from why are there no American drivers in Formula One to why would there be? Why should there be? In order to understand how I kind of got here, and we'll see where you land, we're going to break this down into two main acts, tradition and development. There's a lot of crossover between this, in my opinion, and why Formula One in general isn't bigger in the States regarding fans. After all, the sports can't exist without the audience. There's a couple general trends that are worth noting. Again, these are generalities, and to get a good look at tradition and culture, it's best to do it from 10,000 feet. The first major deviation between American and European cultures as it related to auto racing is most visible post-World War II, but even before then, there was another major event that shaped auto racing from the US perspective and had a major influence on what is now modern-day NASCAR. What is that event? Bootlegging. That's right, you heard me, bootlegging. What does illegal liquor have to do with racing? It's a great question. It all came down to Prohibition. Prohibition was a time period between 1920 and 1933 that the 18th Amendment of the US Constitution outlawed selling, making, and importing alcohol. Not only did an entire industry pop up around illegal alcohol, those capable of moving the product safely and evading the law became a profitable skill. In order to move illegal alcohol, the brewer would need someone talented enough behind the wheel to safely deliver a batch without suspicion. Because much of the key distribution began in the Appalachians, the driver had to be especially quick, careful, and understand how to fully maximize the engineering of the car. Because it wasn't a matter of if you'd be chased by the cops, it was when. Even after Prohibition ended, drivers were more hooked to the thrill of the drive in those souped-up stock cars than they were the money they were making. These drivers now moved on to what we call moonshine running. By the time we got to NASCAR being founded, many of the drivers who entered the first competition were known moonshine runners. That includes the winner, Red Byron. He was a notable shine runner and ended up winning Daytona Beach, the first ever event. All throughout the Second War, major manufacturers like Ford were focusing on delivering to the United States military, and then post-war, delivering an affordable consumer car. That was the mission. There really wasn't an interest in Ford Motor Company and these sort of competitive or at least endurance races until the mid-60s, where we see Ford actually win their first Indy 500 with, ironically, Jim Clark, followed only by Graham Hill in 1966 with Ford-powered engines. But let's actually go back to NASCAR. In order to do that, let's talk about the legendary Bill France Sr. In 1948, he held a league of races and called it NASCAR with multiple classes of cars. The first season was held on 52 altered dirt track races. As the US recovered from World War II, so did the demand in the market for these consumer cars. Now that the consumer cars were back being ordered again, these manufacturers could afford creating them to race them in Bill France Sr.'s new stock car race. It wasn't until the following year that Bill France created NASCAR that he had the first strictly stock-only race in 1949. In the beginning, it was important to France to keep the cars virtually unmodified, but modifications were inevitable. Famously, Jim Roper, winner of the inaugural stock-only race, was found to have altered rear springs and was disqualified. So began the improvements to the stock cars. France became warm to the idea, and throughout the 50s, stock cars changed more and more to enhance performance and safety, eventually becoming fully modified race machines, but having the stock body that the consumers would actually be purchasing. Now that we've discussed Bill France's NASCAR, we can talk about another interesting event. Just 2 years later, the formation of the Formula One World Championships began as a single-seater race league and the highest class sanctioned by the FIA. F1 made a stop at the Indy 500, which naturally dissuaded European manufacturers from having a presence at the US-based racing event. Road car manufacturers like Mercedes, Ferrari, Maserati, Alfa, they were all engaged in a battle of engineering supremacy to create modified cars built for track performance. They had to be the fastest through twists, turns, high speeds, and on the intense Formula One calendar. This included cars like the '51 Jaguar XK120C, the Alfa Romeo 1952 Disco Volante, and Carroll Shelby's drive at Le Mans, the Aston Martin DBR1. Then another interesting thing took place in 1955 that deviated the path of European racing and American racing. The introduction of the Chrysler 300, which burst on the scene. This sparked a major power battle between GM, Ford, and Chrysler. All three were offering cars to the American people while racing them fiercely on track. This was consistent with France Senior's vision of the consumer sitting in a car you drive to work to provide for your middle-class family, and then turn around and watch on TV the same car battling at extremely high speeds on television. At the same time this is happening, you have the formation of the Formula One championships and a rivalry between European manufacturers to create vehicles designed to perform on track. So with all that said, you can boil it down simply to racing culture in America has always been centered around what the average person can drive, for the most part. Many early American race drivers were just that, average people who fell into stock racing. Things have shifted over time, of course, especially with the introduction of mainstream presence of other racing series, like IndyCar notably, but cultures are long trends and take time to shift. They're embedded in us as youngsters, which takes us to our next act, development. Formula One drivers are groomed, they're molded, and early. There's so much involved with becoming a top driver and getting a Formula One seat. And this act will focus on the development aspect of why there aren't many Formula One drivers who are Americans and achieve notable success. It's not uncommon that a Formula One driver comes from a family of drivers. It takes that kind of commitment, that early with a steady influence from, say, an immediate family member, to set yourself up on the path to sit in a top-ranked single-seater in the world. You're much more embedded in the pipeline if you have a family member around you who have raced before. Even if you had all that, you still need exposure and financial backing. A big hurdle, of course, is money. It's not cheap to be a Formula One driver. It's not cheap to be developed. But it's more than money. In Formula One, there are only 20 seats in the world. Many drivers need to navigate the political world, as well as have doors open for them. You need a development seat for a team to guide you through your career. Let's take a quick glimpse at the current world champion, Lewis Hamilton, and his path to Formula One. That way we can get a good understanding and understand the gravity and importance of being close to the action and how having backing can seriously propel your career. Here's a high-level summary of how Lewis even got into Formula One. Coming from a bit of a non-traditional background, Hamilton actually started racing RC karts as early as 6. He was quite good and made even his first of many television appearances. He began racing karts at Rye House, and by 10 he was champion of Super 1. Just 1 year later he won the Champions of the Future, a McLaren-sponsored kart series. These 2 kart championships gave him access to none other than McLaren's Ron Dennis. It was there that Lewis famously told him he wants to drive for McLaren, and Ron, in response, said, "Come back when you're 19 and they'll talk." In 1997, Lewis made his McLaren backing official, and he joined the McLaren Mercedes Young Driver program and earned a runner-up spot at just 13 years old in the JICA kart series. Lewis started racing international karts and was paired off with his future teammate Nico Rosberg. He then moved to Super 8 karts with Nico and progressed through the ranks. Hamilton worked his way through Formula Renault, F3, and GP2, where he was stellar especially. That entire experience, Lewis Hamilton's journey to F1, that all paid off. That entire investment amounted to one of the best rookie drives, arguably, we've ever seen in Formula One history. So as you can see, it takes a lot of time, sacrifice, hard work, money, training, and support. Hamilton was not only racing in different series championships around the world from a young age, he was against future Formula One drivers as well, like Kubica and Rosberg. Hamilton's career really isn't that unique to any other driver who's fighting for a Formula One seat. Many of the drivers, if you look at how they came up, had something similar. Contrast that to the exposure a young American driver has, someone who's interested in single-seat racing. When you're consistently racing the kind of talent an F1 driver sees in Europe versus what an F1 driver would potentially see in America, you're honing a different skill set. You're racing against a different class of driver. And really, that's meant to be no knock on the driver programs in America. That's really to say, it's just a different set of driver. When you look at who is a Formula One champion, who's on the Formula One grid, and where they come from, it's just a math problem. It's a simple exposure issue. We think back to situations like Andretti, who casually bumped into the Lotus team owner. It's those situations that when you're in the action, when you're teammates with someone, those are the connections you make. And if you're not there, it's really hard to forge that and use that later, which as a driver trying to make a Formula One seat, you need everything you can possibly get. You think back to drivers that are currently on the grid. Think about Verstappen, Leclerc, Albon, Russell, Norris. All these drivers have competed against each other for years. They've competed in F3. They've competed in GP2. Even with Esteban Ocon coming back on, he's famously competed with Verstappen. So these drivers are not new to racing each other, and they've been racing each other their whole entire life. But just because it's difficult doesn't make it impossible. When you look at drivers who have raced in more than just a handful of races or more than just the Indy 500, which would technically count as a Formula One race depending on when, these dedicated American Formula One drivers, they found a way to recreate the prototypical European youth driving experience and the rise you would see typically. They just have to improvise in some places. So here are a couple examples of some more notable drivers who are American that have made it to Formula One. We might as well start with Mario Andretti, the last American to win a Grand Prix. Andretti is a naturalized citizen who immigrated here when he was 15. His Formula One breakthrough came as a result of meeting Colin Chapman, owner of Lotus, at an Indy 500 event. In that conversation, Andretti had expressed to Chapman that he wanted to drive in Formula One, and Chapman said, "Whenever you're ready, let me know." And sure enough, a young Andretti let him know, and Chapman held up his word. Andretti actually went out and took pole in the US Grand Prix. He drove the Lotus 49 to do that. After being in and out for a couple seasons, he drove full-time actually in Formula One for the American outfit Parnelli in 1975. They eventually would collapse just a couple races into the following season. But because he was exposed and on the scene, he was able actually to return to Lotus and capitalize on his relationships there. And lucky for him, Lotus had been developing the revolutionary ground effects and had that up their sleeves. And just a few short years later, in 1978, he became the second American to win a Formula One championship. And while it's important to call out Andretti here, it's also important to note he's certainly not the norm. He's certainly not what you can count on in terms of being so talented that even for him, he still struggled in Formula One stepping into that class of car. It wasn't as if it was just night and day, switched 1 year later, and then the next one he was winning world championships. Let's talk about the other American to win a world championship. So let's talk about Phil Hill, the only American-born Formula One champion. He also went to Europe and spent some time racing there. He was another anomaly, though, in that his brilliance behind the car, and also, interestingly, his relaxed demeanor. He never really called himself a racer, so to speak. His 1961 championship changed him forever, though, and it actually, in my opinion, ended his career mentally. He was actually picked up by Enzo Ferrari in a driver's program. He later graduated to drive for Ferrari proper. The year that Phil Hill won, he was actually being beaten by his teammate Wolfgang von Trips headed into Monza, their home race. Tragedy struck when von Trips crashed his Ferrari and unfortunately never fully recovered from the accident, taking 14 spectators with him. It was an absolute horrible day for Formula One and for Ferrari. Coming into the next season, he was quoted as saying, "I no longer have as much need to race, to win. I don't have as much hunger anymore." He left Ferrari 1 season later, not surprisingly. Another driver that's interesting to talk about is Alexander Rossi. He's an American driver who had links to step into a Formula One seat full-time. Rossi made the choice to move to Europe to race in GP3, which resembles a lot of the other decisions that young drivers make just much earlier. This ultimately would be a good decision, as he landed a test driving role and even drove for Marussia in 5 Grand Prix in 2015. Marussia became Manor in 2016, and Rossi was replaced. He returned to Indy cars in 2016 in the States, and immediately he won the Indy 500. Rossi is a great example of, regardless of being American or not, if you're a talented driver and you start your career in the right place and get the right exposure, you have a shot. And Rossi was there. He really did put himself in a situation where it very much was his seat. It just happened to be that they picked other drivers. Lastly, let's talk about Scott Speed, but for a very specific reason. We see proof of the power of a feeder program. He raced for Toro Rosso and ultimately was replaced by a young talent, I don't know if you've heard of him, Sebastian Vettel. Speed found his role as a result of winning the driver search program, which is essentially just the Young Drivers Academy for Red Bull in the States. The Red Bull Drivers program was the closest thing to the most appropriate action that would lead to more Americans in Formula One racing. So think back now to how you felt when we opened the video with Gunther Steiner's quote. Signing an American driver would be an ambition, but at the moment there is nobody ready for Formula One in the United States, in my opinion. Now that we've gone through that, doesn't that quote sound a little bit different? What Gunther's saying is, you can't just step into Formula One. Sure, there's plenty of drivers that have the capability if they've gone through the proper channels. It's not to say that a driver isn't good enough to step into Formula One ever. It's to say that those skills, they are honed over time. They are honed racing the best. They are honed by making your mistakes early. A driver like, for instance, Alexander Rossi had years of experience in his youth program driving at some of those circuits. With every single time, if you're stepping into the car and you need to perform at the very, very highest of levels, Formula One doesn't have any room to make mistakes. You don't get multiple years to practice. If you've never driven half the circuits, That alone makes his comment viable. Which takes me back to my initial point to begin with. And the question I think this really should be about is, it's not really why are there no American drivers in Formula One? It's really, why would there be? Why should there be? There are plenty of racing series in America. When you spend your entire youth racing career racing on the same tracks you hope to be racing on in 10 more years, when you're meeting the same people, when you're driving the same competitors, that's an entirely different environment than someone who's racing in a different series, in a different type of car. Why would there be more American Formula One drivers? It's not about the talent or the skill, it's just about the exposure and the fact that these are two different sports. But what do you think? Why do you think there are no American Formula One drivers? Is there something more to this that I missed? Let me know in the comment section below, and make sure to check out the next story in our F1 Wars and our other story-based Formula One content. Every single week, on top of all the other content I'll be posting in the interim, but expect this at the same time, the same day. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this. Make sure to leave any feedback so I can improve this experience for you in the comment section below. Subscribe or share the video if I earned it, and I'll see you guys soon. Thanks a lot.